Okay, well, moving on now. In a world of 10,000 countries, that is how the people of China imagined things 3,000 years ago. A vast array of lands that have gradually reduced to leave fewer and bigger countries or states today, like China itself. Today, the notion of the great state has taken hold, but how did that form and where does it leave us going forward? Well, to give us his perspective, we're joined on-site by historian and Chinese expert Timothy Brook. Mr. Brook, your new book out in English, it's called Great State, China and the World. It brings us back through the centuries, and reading it, it becomes clear that that notion of a mega-state really wasn't an innate Chinese idea.
No, it was an idea that really came into view in the 13th century. It sounds a little odd to sort of just reel out the centuries as I'm going to do, but the Chinese usually think of their political formation as starting in the 3rd century BC. I want to move it forward to the 13th century. It's much more recent for me. It's not for you, of course. But it happens because China is transformed by outsiders again and again. The Mongols invade in the 13th century, the Manchus invade in the 17th century, the Japanese invade in the 20th century. And these invasions have been fundamental to shaping the way China has become today.
And in many ways, it helped China grow. I mean, after each invasion, they held the land that was...
Exactly. China did not somehow naturally just expand over time. It was captured, and that capture then produced a larger state. And each time the capture has occurred, it's produced an ever larger state. This is a history that has been interesting for me to try and reconstruct, because most Chinese will not recognize the China that I am describing in this book. They tend to think of themselves, as most nationals do, you think of yourself as part of this national story that has been going on for centuries. But in fact, China's national story is very different from the one that children are taught in school.
It does show this pattern, though, of fear of the foreigner and then in some ways benefiting from the outside influence.
It's highly contradictory, because China's involvement with the foreign world has in fact strengthened it. And yet there is a sort of nativist anxiety about the foreign world coming in from the outside. So it's a double situation that I think has made it difficult for trust to be established between China and the world. And we're certainly in a moment of that right now in 2019.
Indeed, it looks very much like the pattern is once again repeating itself. I mean, now we're talking about trade with the US. In your book, it's the trade with Europe back in the 17th century. Is that not surprising that these same themes, this same reaction is happening once again when you look even at the situation in Hong Kong today?
Well, I don't want to say that we can look back to history and that gives us all the answers, because the context of the present is constantly changing. So we can't necessarily predict what China does now from what it did in the past. But I think if we know a little bit more about what happened in the past, it gives us a better place from which to think about, well, what is China doing now? China's working very much from a point of anxiety. China's not feeling confident in the world. It's anxious about the world. And the current lack of trust among nations and national leaders is making China even more anxious about its place in the world, and therefore more anxious to assert itself as a kind of rightful main player on the world stage at the moment.
Indeed, I mean, China then still in a way seeing itself as a victim of colonization, and yet many people would say it's the main perpetrator today. I mean, it still, has many disputes going on, and one of them, Taiwan, for example, you mentioned there's 2 Chinas that still exist today.
Yes. This is a creation of the United Nations system. China was a founding member in 1945. But then the country that occupied the seat was the Republic of China on Taiwan. It wasn't the People's Republic. That changed. And so China is still trying to sort out its own identity with regard to itself as much as with regard to the world.
Indeed, and fascinating to see that the small islands like Tuvalu and Nauru are 20,000 people, and they can wield such control now over a population so much more vast.
Yes. So but I think this is always true. We're always living in a world that is in some ways constructed by arrangements and alliances that on the ground don't really mean what they appear to mean. So we have a formal system of the United Nations, which was built in order to create this international trust. But that system is not working terribly well. Not to say that we should get rid of that system, but that we need to, as a world, I think we need to align what we do with what we say is important. So self-determination, the respect for all peoples, that sort of thing seems to be kind of at a low ebb at the moment.
Indeed, and I guess the crux of it all is trust, as you say, but a fascinating book with lots of other revelations. For me, where Dalai Lama first came from was completely new. So thanks a lot for coming in and giving us some insight into your book, Timothy Brook, and his new book out in English, to remind you at home. It is called Great State, China and the World. It sums up pretty much 7 centuries in 13 or so stories.
Exactly.
Mr. Brook, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.